Welcome to Quality Time with MoreSteam. I am your host, Dan Swartwout. Today, we are joined by two-time Shingo Prize Award winner, Drew Locher. This is a great conversation, so I want to get right to it. Thank you so much and welcome to the show. Today, we are lucky enough to be joined by Shingo Prize Award winner, Drew Locher. Drew, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dan, for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
I am looking forward to this as well. And you are now the second Shingo Prize Award winner to appear on the show. We had Peter Ward with us a few months ago, and that was a great episode. I know this will be a great episode as well. Could you tell us a little bit about your background?
I kind of grew up in the General Electric company back in the 80s. I was part of one of their corporate management development programs. And that was where I was first introduced to what we called back then world-class concepts. Today we would call enterprise excellence, operational excellence, lean concepts. And we were expected to apply those concepts in whatever management role that we had within a large, diverse, organization. So I was there for about 7, 8 years. I did what I was told. I didn't know any better. Then I left in 1990, though I still consulted with them because one of the things I learned was that 80% of all this is behavioral, and I didn't feel I was as equipped as I needed to be in that area. So I went back to school. It's kind of how I do things. I went back to school for organizational behavioral science. Did 3 years at Cornell, and then I was doing some consulting while I was at school. But really starting in 1993, just kind of starting my own thing, working with all kinds of different organizations and all kinds of different industries, not just manufacturing, but I was working with healthcare back in the mid 90s, transportation company, a trucking company was one of my very first customers, financial institutions. Just kind of doing that through the 90s, had a great learning opportunities to work with some very small family-owned businesses like in manufacturing that were what we would call job shops, which made me kind of think about how to apply, like adapt the concepts where necessary. You have to. I learned that as a lesson. And when lean started coming, that terminology came out beginning in 97 with lean thinking. Got actually connected with Jim Womack and Dan Jones, who were the co-authors of lean thinking, helping them start up the Lean Enterprise Institute in the States, the Lean Enterprise Academy in the US, and then their global network. They would send some of the early faculty members of the Institute around to help get some of these other these institutes around the world going. So I've been doing that for a while. I was always in and out of universities. I spent 5 years at the University of Michigan, then 5 years at Ohio State, and then back at the University of Michigan. Basically teaching enterprise excellence through their programs, their delivering programs for them.
Tell me a little bit about your Shingo Prize award-winning book, The Complete Lean Enterprise. You co-wrote that book with Bo Keat, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Tell me, how did that collaboration come about and what was the impetus for writing this book?
Okay. Well, actually, two of my books have received Shingo prizes. So,
Whoa.
Yeah.
So you're like the Michael Jordan of the Shingo.
No, that would be Jeffrey Liker.
Okay.
He probably has a dozen of them by now. I think he lost count. But we always tried in the early days, the community, and there was a community. We would get together, it was all around the Lean Enterprise Institute and trying to support Jim Womack and Dan Jones. We would sit around and say, okay, what's out there in terms of books and references and case studies, because people need that. It helps them understand how to apply the concepts, but also gives them some confidence to do so. And, we would sit around once a year, there was like 6 of us or so, 7 faculty members at the time, and just say, what's out there, what's not out there, who wants to fill that gap in the knowledge base. So Bo and I decided to do Office because there was really nothing out there. And we started with a value stream mapping book, kind of patterning after the original book that LEI had published, Learning to See from John Shook and Mike Rother. So we applied that methodology of improvement to office and service environments. Then I followed up with a how-to lean book that I wrote myself several years later, Lean Office and Service Simplified, with how do you apply visual management, how do you apply standard work, how do you, and so on, how do you do flow in offices, the chapter basically on each. And then, that also received the Shingo Prize because there was nothing out there. Other folks on the faculty at LEI, one colleague wrote on kind of shorter run mixed model flow book. I was in the middle of writing that, but he was so far along. I was like, go, you finished yours and we'll go work on the office book. I always try to not just repeat what's already been out there, but try to fill a real gap in the knowledge base. That's always my approach for all 4 books.
So you've written a total of 4 books, 2 of which have won Shingo Prizes. That's a 500% batting average. That's pretty good.
Yeah, I didn't submit the 4th one. I didn't think it was worthy. It was actually the second one. Was another mapping book, how to apply it to product development processes, not just products, but it could be service, any sort of development, because there was nothing out there as well. Jeffrey Liker wrote a great book on the Toyota product development system, and this was to accompany that, kind of a how-to book. How do you get your head and hands around a very complex system? And product development is about as complex as it gets. It's probably the only thing that maybe keeps me up a little at night before when I facilitate those exercises.
Right.
But, unfortunately, the committee at Shingo didn't see that it was worthy. I won't get into the details, but I will say they changed the rules of how things qualified based on my rejection.
We're talking about value stream mapping, and what is one of the biggest rookie mistakes that you see people making as they start the value stream mapping process?
There's really 2.
Okay.
The first is on the current state, as you know, you do a current state map and a future state map. So the whole methodology is based on a state model for change, which has been around since the 1960s. So in the current state mapping development, the kind of rookie mistake that people make is they don't go see the work.
Right.
They'll sit in a conference room and they'll put these maps up on the wall, but they don't actually see the work being performed. And that is a big no-no. Because if you don't see the work, this map is just this 2-dimensional artifact. There's no context to it. And you're making a very big assumption that people on the mapping team who have been tasked with this exercise, they understand what is being verbally described.
Right.
And that's a big no-no. So in manufacturing, you go see the production processes being performed. How long you go see depends, right? If it's very simple, more simple work that has very quick cycle times, you can be out there for a half hour watching 30 or more iterations of a process. And if it's hours of work, you're still going to go see, have people describe it, look at the situation, the machine, the layout, the environment. You'll still see all that, but you can't spend hours observing work. I mean, I've mapped out everything from, the total value added content is, a minute of work to millions of hours to design and construction of a nuclear aircraft carrier.
Wow.
So you couldn't see millions of hours, but we still drove the site to see, because you learn so much from that. In office environments, it's actually easier to go see because you don't have to cram into someone's cubicle or office. You could actually have them show you the work up on a monitor in a conference room, a meeting room, where everyone can see. We still walk the flow to see the environment, see how it is it conducive to the work. So the fact that in office environments the work tends to be more digital really lends itself to, hey, I can still do it, and you guys can all see me do it. Even better than kind of, again, cramming into someone's cubicle, which we've done. You can only get so many people in a cubicle before it's just too many. That's probably one of the biggest mistakes I've seen in the current state mapping. The other really my pet peeve is the future state map.
Mm-hmm.
I get a lot of maps from people over the years. Hey, can you check this out for me? What do you think? And they'll give me a current state map, and it'll look pretty good. I don't know if they did what I described in constructing it. Go see the work, but it looks good. But then I'll say, well, where's your future state map? And then they'll send me like a current state map with like 100 little post-its on it of all these ideas they have and waste that they saw in the current state. I'm like, well, that's not a real proper future state map. And then, of course, they'll take these long lists and prioritize them and then make, assign people to all 100 and dates, start dates, end dates, and put together these very elaborate plans. And I'll say, so you really didn't do a proper future state map. And so did you use it all the future state questions? And this is no exaggeration, probably 8 out of 10 times when I get to this point, conversation, they'll say, what are those? And I said, so you really didn't read the whole book or books because they're right in the front cover, inside cover of Learning to See, and both of my mapping books, which cover the 3 primary value streams that businesses could be involved in, manufacturing, office and service, and development, kind of the engineering design kind of value stream. So I'll say, you see, you didn't really read the book or the inside cover, because that's the real power of value stream mapping. It's not the map. People have been mapping for years, but it's how do you redesign it based on these principles of value flow, pull, leveling, and so forth. And we're going to manage that system or value stream differently. Those concepts are embedded in the future state question. So if you don't use those, I don't know what you're doing. So, and this is very, very common. I've been running around the last couple of years for a large corporation. It has like 24 businesses, sites. I've been at 10 so far. And the reason they brought me in was because they read the books and they realized they weren't doing value stream mapping properly. So I had to basically retrain their lean folks, some of which did not take kindly to that. But I would always ask, so how's it working for you? These long lists, and they're like, and then they get quiet, like, well, not so well. I was like, well, how would you know? Well, we don't always implement a lot, and also we don't see any significant measurable change in performance of that value stream. Like, because it's the approach you're taking. We want to do a few things, do them well, and move on. We don't want to do 100 things. I usually come up with no more than 8 to 12 substantive projects. Don't get me wrong, but that's it. Not 100. That's, to me, always the biggest gap I see is the future state design.
Drew, you mentioned the importance of visiting the Gemba, and we talk about that all the time on this show. We talk about that all the time in Lean. So much can be learned from visiting the Gemba. Why do you think that some people don't do it or are reluctant to visit the Gemba when it's so crucial to so many things?
Yeah, I think it's just lack of awareness and habit, current habits. You have to make it a habit. I made this mistake years and years ago when I first started over. Our team meetings had to be in a meeting room, a conference room, things like that. And we would be talking about problems. And, my mentor on the subject of continuous improvement say, you got to go see the problem. Get your group out, go see. We didn't call it go to the Gemba. We just call it go see. And I'm like, okay. Because I saw very early, because I was prompted to do so, the benefit of that. Because what we were discussing in the room was very different than what we saw, whether it be the problem that someone was trying to describe or a process situation someone was trying to describe. So just to engage more senses, like your eyes, your sight, sense of sight, beyond just your hearing, is critically important. So we were always taught, go where the problem is, because you might find the solution there, go to the process, go to the people, go where the work is. Again, we didn't use the term Gemba in the 80s, but I didn't, come across that term until the late 90s, to be frank, when I started working with some of the ex-Toyota folks. So, I think it's just a habit. I'll still see today, I'll be in a room with people and they're talking about a problem. And I'll be like, can we go see it? And then I'll, afterwards, I'll make a teaching point out of it. And so you guys got to get into this practice. If anyone's talking about something and you're not there, go do it. Now, sometimes there's some obstacles to that. There can be some safety concerns, but you have to prepare. But it's always great learning for everyone. You get this collective understanding much better than just talking about a problem or a process situation.
You mentioned Toyota, and as a University of Michigan Toyota Kata instructor, what starter Kata routine do you teach to build scientific thinking? And how do you coach teams to make it a daily habit, talking about habits rather than a workshop souvenir, so to speak?
So the terminology of Toyota Kata came from our colleague Mike Rother, who wrote a book probably about 12 years now ago, called that. And I begged him not to call it that, but he kind of insisted. So it's really about rapid PDCA cycles, plan, do, check, act cycles.
Right.
And I've said for decades to leaders, yeah, we can do events, we can do value stream mapping events, we can do rapid improvement or multi-day Kaizen events. But ultimately, all roads are going to lead to that frontline supervisor or manager working with their natural work group to continuously improve. Don't need team charters, it doesn't need to be cross-functional teams usually. We're talking small incremental improvement. And Toyota distinguishes between the scope and scale of improvement. There's Kaizen, which is incremental improvement. They use that term for, but then they have, maybe mispronouncing it. I don't speak Toyota or Japanese. Kaikaku, which is for radical system redesign and improvement. That's where value stream mapping is used, or even rapid improvement or Kaizen events for big change, rapid change, significant. But you still need that incremental improvement, and you need a methodology to do that. And Plan, Do, Check, Act provides that. Now, what the author did is add a few steps to it, which we did back in GE, because there's a lot going on in Plan. So we broke it down to, it's more like 7 steps, but you might not be pleased about that. But, it all comes from Dr. Deming. And Dr. Deming was always clear, all improvement should be directional. It should have purpose. It gives purpose. So that's step 1. Step 2 is grasp current conditions. That's true of every improvement methodology. Don't go tinkering with things if you don't really understand how things are operating today. That's where re-engineering the corporation went horribly wrong in the early 90s, to the point where the authors of that publicly apologized at least twice for the whole thing.
Wow.
Then step 3 is set your target condition. So you know where you're at, you know where you want to be in terms of some measurable point. And then you plan, do, check, act. So altogether, it's really 7 steps. So that's the methodology. So you want rapid practice, rapid PDCA cycles, because what you're trying to do is develop skills, mindsets, and ultimately habits for improvement. And we know what it takes to create habits. We've known for over 100 years. It's repetition. But it's repetition to a pattern, a set pattern. If you're willy-nilly about anything, including improvement, your learning will be greatly slowed down. So you have this pattern that I just rattled off, these 4 steps that are really 7 steps. So that provides a pattern. Human brain will latch on to patterns, and then you do these, you try to do very small scale efforts, not big goals, measurable goals, but shorter goals you think you can do in a couple of months. And then the PDCA cycles, you're looking for very small changes you can do relatively quickly and see the results, be able to assess the results to check. So you want to be able to do the plan, do, check within a week. The author ideally was thinking daily, but he's backed off of that as well. But the bottom line is doing it more frequent, because the more frequent you practice, the quicker you'll develop the skills and mindsets and ultimately the habits.
We've been talking a lot on the show recently about lean in sectors other than manufacturing. We've had a lot of guests from healthcare on the show lately. And when you're talking about lean in healthcare or education, it's different, obviously. So, what unique challenges still trip people up in those sectors outside of manufacturing? And where's today's biggest knowledge gap?
Well, the best description I've ever heard of these concepts is it's a structured approach to common sense. But common sense is not so common. And common
Right.
sense is most definitely needed in every sector, every industry. So I had the great opportunity, my co-author of the first book, Bill Keat, as well, to work with healthcare organizations as far back as the late 80s, I
Oh, wow.
recall. And I kind of gave up. He kind of hung in there a little longer by the mid 90s because they just weren't ready for it. The circumstances just weren't ready for it. It just wasn't. So the circumstances changed in that industry. They couldn't just charge whatever they wanted to charge. People started really looking at how much we pay in the US for healthcare. So all of a sudden, the mindsets changed. There was a need for this. And in early 2000s, we started getting a lot more interest again in that sector. I give that as an example because it's really very fundamental is change, the ability to change, which starts with the willingness and the need to change. I always tell organizations when they call me, can you come help me do lean? The first question I ask is why? Why do you want to do this? And, oh, my neighbors are doing it is not a good enough reason, or I read a book is not a good enough reason. What's your business reason? And industry by industry, you can kind of, have that conversation, and it might be a little different in each industry, healthcare just being one of those. Now, once you have the proper purpose, and going back to Deming, you have to have purpose for this. Then it's like, all right, your ability to change, and humans are not capable of that, and most humans, but it's a skill that can be developed over time. And that's the big obstacle it's the common obstacle across all industries, humans' ability to change. So that's what we've got to overcome. And with mixed results, I can speak from my personal experience, we've had mixed results. Some people just aren't able to change. Some people, again, don't have that inspirational purpose to change or can't convey it. A lot of it's leadership, to be honest. Deming always said the problem is leadership. And that's the issue everywhere. Like, you brought up healthcare. So they have an expression that they would, readily recognize, which is the blame and shame culture of healthcare. So, for decades, you had the first response to a problem is who did that? And that's not going to get us to where we got to go, where, we treat problems as opportunities, as gold, and encourage people to bring up problems. You're not going to get that in that industry. Now, we have pockets now. We have case studies and examples. Some have been able to sustain, some have lost their way a bit. But that usually gives people confidence when they see examples in their own industry, but not always. Like our shining example was ThedaCare for the sustained application of lean in healthcare in Wisconsin. And they always would open their doors to anyone in healthcare, but the requirement was your CEO had to be there. You couldn't just send someone else. He or she just couldn't send someone else. And they pretty much stuck to that rule, and they would go through the day. Sometimes I would be kind of observing, groups. And I remember distinctly one group I observed during the day. I went to the airport to leave that evening, and there they were, and they were sitting behind me, and they were just talking to each other, trying to talk themselves out of why they couldn't do what they just saw for a whole day with measurable results and years of data now behind it. ThedaCare was very good at gathering that data and making the case. And I finally got up and turned around, and they were like, "Oh, we recognize you." And I just kind of let them have it. I said, "Listen to yourselves. You're trying to talk yourselves out of this. You just saw it happen. Yeah, I'm sure you have different circumstances in terms of relationships with your employees, your staff." I said, "But that shouldn't be a reason to talk yourself out of it. That really is a reason that screams that you need to do these things, because it's a people-centric system at its core." But change is tough for people. That's why I went back to school for organizational behavioral science, so I could learn more about humans and how they handle change. And boy, I wish I knew the prior 7 years what I learned in school. I would have taken much better approaches and had much better results. I would have expected.
Drew, your answer made me think of some of our past episodes and for examples of healthcare systems that are doing very well with continuous improvement. We've had guests on the show from Dartmouth Health and from Thomas Jefferson University, right near you, there in
Mhm.
Philadelphia. So if you need the inspiration for healthcare systems that are doing it well, you can go back and listen to those episodes. And then
Yeah.
another thing I was thinking about, we had Ryan Weiss on the show, and he talked about mindset. And he specifically asked someone who was hiring him for a job, do you hire people with the wrong mindset or do they develop the wrong mindset over time while working here?
Yeah. It's a
And what
brilliant
you were
question.
just talking about was mindset, the mindset that we cannot do this. How do you overcome that?
First of all, that just tells me people got to improve their interviewing processes, and think about behavioral interviewing.
Right.
But going back to, so what do we do about this, right? So the approach that we take is critical. One, again, we have to have a purpose.
Hmm.
Humans aren't going to change for the sake of changing. They're going to stay in their, as Lou Tice many years ago called it, their comfort zone. And this is innate in humans. It helps us continue to feel safe. We use less energy. The brain tries to conserve energy. So it doesn't want to try new things. It really doesn't. I always use the example, like you drive home. Let's say you have a regular path home to and from work. And all of a sudden, you can most evenings you get home, you don't even think about how you got there. But if you have to do a detour, all of a sudden you're thinking a lot more, where am I going? And when you get home, you tend to be a little more fatigued. That's just an example of how it works, any change. So how do we overcome this? First and foremost, we have to have a purpose that people can accept, right? And we have to be able to bring it to an individual level, a personal level. Once we have that, then it's really more change management. So one of the big things that I see still today is big projects. Big projects. Got to do big projects that represent one big plan, do, check, act cycle. And it might be months before we get through that cycle. Well, big projects, usually people look at that, and from a practical standpoint, time, that's a lot of work I got to put in. Yeah.
Hmm.
But also from a change management standpoint, they're going to be more fearful. It represents bigger change. You're
Hmm.
not changing one thing, two things, we're changing like 50 things, and that scares the heck out of people. So chunking it down, even a big project, how do I chunk that down to a series of PDCA cycles? People will be more accepting of trying smaller scale change. They feel safer doing it just by the nature of the scale of it. So an example would be, we're going to put a new computer system into a university, which is like a city, a small town.
Hmm.
Oh, we're going to roll this out across all the schools or all the people that are going to use whatever it is. Maybe it's administrative, maybe it's faculty, I don't know. But that's how most would do it. And I worked with a university a couple of years ago, and they told me this is the biggest thing they learned from me. Don't do that, because that's what they did for decades. We would say, okay, let's do a change in one school, maybe two, that maybe have the biggest piece of that. Let's learn from that experience, go through the PDCA cycles, learn from that experience, adjust where we have to, then start rolling it out in a way that is manageable. And, some would argue, well, that's going to take longer. No, actually it's quicker. What people don't recognize is all the rework loops they go through. Or like in the example that I'm thinking of is a procurement system at a university. They were 5 years into a new system and they found out maybe half of the university was using it after 5 years. I might be kind there. And it was
Wow.
all about the approach that they took. I mean, think about training people on a new computer system. How do you do that? You're talking hundreds of people, in a university with thousands of employees.
Hmm.
Well, they would do it in large lecture halls holding 300 people. You can't do adequate training in a large lecture hall. It's ridiculous. So the approach we take of chunking it down to allow for more rapid PDCA cycles. Another example, like maybe we're going to make a change in a policy, like a customer facing policy or process. Let's introduce it to a customer, or maybe 2 or 3, maybe some friendly ones, you know, not the 1,000 customers we have. We'll be able to do it quicker. We'll be able to do the plan quicker just by scaling it down. That's almost always true. And we'll be able to learn from that experience, adjust as necessary, and then start rolling it out. And you can use those early experiences to help sell to the folks that are going to come after that. So, I mean, I can get more into how we approach it, but that's the biggie. Just from a leadership standpoint, Deming always said we have to provide a safe environment. Well, how do we do that? And leaders have to do that.
Right.
Sometimes it can be just small scale. Let's try it out in the corner over here, you know, see how it works before we go live, you know, that kind of thing. Sometimes it's just words. Words matter with all this. So letting people know, yeah, we know things are going to get worse before they get better when we affect this change, because that's just normal. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Letting people know nothing's cast in stone, that if this doesn't work, we'll try something else, you know, and I can go on for like dozens of examples of this, but, you know, leaders, the words leaders use, have to provide a safe environment for people being willing to try things, you know, try things out.
One thing I think is really interesting, and I want to talk a little bit about leadership a little bit more. But before that, you had mentioned earlier blaming and shaming culture. And Peg Pennington mentioned that in our very first episode. So it's always been on my mind throughout the course of this show. How do you balance not creating a blaming and shaming culture with sometimes you have to point out that somebody really messed up? So, how do you find that balance when you have those big problems that somebody might have caused and still want to maintain a culture where people feel that it is okay to try something and maybe it doesn't work?
First and foremost, focus on process.
Okay.
Always focus on process first. There's been many times over the decades, I would physically just stare at a machine or stare at a process, not at the people, because I was sensing they were getting defensive.
Okay.
You know, so if we haven't put a good process in place to begin with, that's been documented in some form of standardized work, and we haven't properly trained people, then I cannot blame anyone for making a mistake. If we did all those things and maybe even put some mistake proofing type techniques in place that they blatantly disregarded, then we're going to have another conversation. I always tell organizations, you're not throwing out your performance evaluation or disciplinary process, you know, but we're going to go through some levels here before we get to that. Okay. And I learned that very early when I was still at General Electric. I would go into different divisions and we had these quality management databases, and, you know, so I could get a lot of data real quick on what kind of problems, defects we had on our products. And one thing that really struck me division after division was the cause. You had a problem, you had a cause, was operator error. Something like 80%, 70 to 80% were operator error. I wasn't buying that. That was just a lazy response of just, oh, here. And then they would go hand it to the supervisor of that person, that operator, to go sign off. And the problems reoccurred. That was just laziness. It was an easy thing to do. But unless, again, we really have a well-defined process, well-designed process that's been documented in some standardized work, and we train people in it, and we gave them all the tools for a good process, you know, to get the right results, and allow the right time, you know, because we have time in our standardized work, you know, what our expectations of time to perform it. If I don't have those things in place, I cannot blame a human. People, I think, will respect that. Now, if again, we put all those things in place and people blatantly don't follow standardized work, and it creates safety issues or quality issues, that's another conversation. But that happens rarely, to be honest. Right. It's happened. I can think of probably a dozen or so. But once we go through all that, it's rare that someone won't do the right thing. So when we do have a quality problem, it's like, okay, where did our process fail? Now, the difficulty with this is, again, habit. If that leader, like in healthcare, the first question is a who question out of their mouth when a problem arises, it's like, you guys got to stop that. And I've had many one-on-one conversations with leaders, managers, not really leaders, saying you gotta watch your language, because I know it's a habit of yours, but this is what we're trying to overcome. And it starts with your wording, your language.
Leadership, you touched on it again. You said that 80% of continuous improvement is behavioral. So, with that in mind, what specific leadership behavior most reliably unlocks team buy in and sustains momentum throughout the continuous improvement process?
And there's a list, but I'll just pull a few. The first and foremost is they have to have passion and commitment.
Uh huh.
If they're not passionate about the change or the need to change, they can't expect anyone else to be. And that happens in a lot of organizations. Maybe a leader will kick off things and say all the right things, but then we never see him or her again, that person again. So that's a problem. And then the commitment, the consistency of commitment. So too often it's like, oh, we're busy, push that aside, push improvement aside. No, we need to do it because we're busy. Or sometimes they'll do it when they're slow because, oh, whatever, they're going to lay people off, they feel, if it's a sustained period of downturn of business. And it's like, no, that's what we really need to do. It. Don't let those people go. Let's focus them in the slow periods on improvement. So that's a commitment. And that commitment has to come through belief.
Mm-hmm.
So where does that come from? And if a leader doesn't have a belief, they're not going to be passionate and they won't be committed and they won't stick with it long enough. I'm always upfront with organizations. It's going to take 3 to 5 years at a single location for the culture to begin to take hold. And even that's not sustainable. If you get a new leader in that doesn't believe in these concepts, and that's what happened with our shining example in healthcare, brought a new leader, said all the right things in the interview with the board, wasn't bought into any of this. And dozens of people left. Now, they will, by their own admission, will acknowledge they got a little out of hand, got a little too much bureaucracy, but those were all things that could be corrected, not abandon the concepts almost altogether. Now, no one ever abandons them completely. You're still going to, as a middle manager, still do what you've seen works as much as you can, in your own sphere of influence. So where do people get the belief? So a great example of this, because then it's the sustaining part, and that's the hard part. And why don't organizations sustain it? Is turnover of people or business circumstances change and the management system isn't working like it used to. That's okay. You have to adjust the management system. Doesn't mean throw it all out. Just tweak it and adjust it as necessary. Or the operational system. A great example of this is Larry Culp, who is a great lean thinker from Danaher for decades, who came out of retirement to lead GE. So, my hope is that will be a new, fresh case study that will get senior leaders interested again. Because I saw it happen years ago with Six Sigma. But what was amazing to me, having grown up in GE, even before they started Six Sigma, that came in the early 90s, but I was consulting with them by that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I gave them some advice to not teach everyone how to do regression and stuff, which they did, and then they backed off. That's where the belts came in way back. But anyway, people outside would look and say, oh, got to do Six Sigma because GE's doing it. What they didn't understand is that was their improvement methodology. There was a business model that they were striving towards, or following, and that was overlooked. So just having an improvement methodology without a direction is not going to bode well. So my hope is Mr. Culp, I have no doubt he'll be successful. That'll be a new case that that still has that name, GE, and that'll get a lot more renewed interest.
Drew, do you know Larry Inks, Dr. Larry Inks at Ohio State?
I do not that I recall.
We had him as a guest on the show. I think you would find that episode fascinating. And one of the things he talked about, and you just mentioned it a little bit ago, but it got me thinking, leadership and management, the
Big difference.
differences between leadership and management,
Hmm.
how they're the same, how they're different. Larry talked a little bit about that. I would love to hear your take on that as well.
I use this expression of builders and maintainers.
Okay.
Managers are maintainers. They're not building processes, they're not building systems, they're not going to improve. So they're there to maintain existing systems. So I just had this conversation with a gentleman before my call with you. And I said, it sounds like you needed to hire a builder and you hired a maintainer, who could be successful if all the systems and processes pre-existed, but they don't. He has his own small business and it's just, he never took the time and he's not very interested in it, but he recognizes he needs to do it.
Uh huh.
But he's got to find someone that's able to do that. And that's a lot of people are incapable. So managers maintain kind of the status quo, but a leader takes a group to another point. And as soon as you do that, now a real leader's got to provide purpose and passion and so on. But a manager, a maintainer, doesn't. What do they need to do? They don't need to truly lead.
Interesting. I'm really thinking about this right now. What would you call somebody who brings passion and purpose and during every episode also maintains this short break? MoreSteam's enterprise process improvement platform includes the tools, training, and software you need to transform your organization into a problem-solving powerhouse. Join the ranks of Fortune 500 companies that trust MoreSteam for their enterprise process improvement. Visit moresteam.com to learn more. And now back to my conversation with Drew Locher. I want to talk about another one of your books, Unleashing the Power of 3P, that explores the production preparation process. Can you explain 3P and share a real world example where it created a breakthrough for both frontline staff and leaders? I'm really interested to hear about this because I don't think we've talked about this yet.
Yeah. So 3P is another of several methodologies of improvement. They're all based on PDCA. It was developed by Nikhil, who was a consultant to Toyota, and then he came over here and started teaching it. It is used to be applied to the design of new or major redesigns of products and processes, ideally concurrently. We used to call it concurrent design, where we would design integrated. We actually called it integrated product and process development in GE speak, because we started this in the mid 80s. I was integral to setting this up, developing our methodology. So you want to create them concurrently, where a lot of organizations, they'll design the product, throw it over the proverbial wall, and operations has to go figure out how to make it. So that's where it ideally is how it's applied. Now we can apply it to other things. Some people call it mini 3P or 2P, where you just, like I've done it with layouts of facilities, layouts of hospital wings, layouts of hospital laboratories. So you're not designing a product, but the process and the layout. That's kind of what its intent is. It's based on several key principles. One is biomimicry. Look for examples of that problem you're trying to solve with a product design or a process that you're trying to design, like a machine or something. How does nature solve that problem or perform that task? And there's a lot of examples in nature that, it's been observations in nature that led to barcoding, for example. Someone realized zebras had unique stripes and said, hey, Velcro was, the invention of Velcro came because someone closely observed, nature, the hook and loop, I think of spiders or something. So we do that. And in the old days, I used to bring stacks of children's books and have them go through. Now I just say, go, get online, search online. So that's one way. And it's a creative 3P it's an innovative creative process, tries to spark innovation. So how do we do that? One is get outside your box, look at nature. That gets you outside your box. There's another technique called 7 ways. And we were doing this, we weren't doing 7, we were doing 3 back in the 80s. But my engineers would come with a solution, whatever business I was running, working in GE. And I'd be like, that's great. Give me 2 more. And they'd be like, well, why? Here's a solution. I was like, right, let's put that aside. Give me 2 more. Well, that's going to take more time. Yeah, I'm giving you the time. I'm your boss. Go take whatever, 2 months, whatever it was, go do it. Or budget. Maybe I had to, offer some budget for it. Later, when I encountered the Cal folks, it was 7 ways. I was like, wow. Because it's easy to come up with 1 way, but to come up, with 4, 5, 6, 7, you really got to look outside your box. So that sparks creativity. It makes you think about things that you didn't think of before, and that's all what it's about. Now, ultimately, you have to narrow. And usually what we do is we take 7 ways, 7 possible solutions. They're rated through a set criteria, and we take the best of pieces of the different 7 and put them together to maybe a 3. So it's not like choosing the best one. It's taking the best elements of each and creating 3 new ones. So 7 ways is one of those key concepts. The third is rapid simulation, which could be rapid prototyping, which is a lot easier to do these days with 3P printer, the 3P printers. We didn't have those back in the day. We had model shops and things that we would mock up things. And what we're trying to do there, whether it's a product, a process, or a layout, ideally to scale. The Nikal folks, the Shingijutsu folks, actually facilitated GE transportation, I think in the early 2000s. Well, you couldn't do that to scale. A locomotive was pretty darn big. So they did it, I forget what scale, quarter scale or something like that. But what you're trying to do there is engage more senses, touch, feel, move things around. People can work, look at it together and bounce ideas off each other. Making the fuzzy tangible, making that 2-dimensional, even a 3-dimensional CAD drawing, something that people can play with. So I always encourage organizations to set up a sandbox where people can play, have set materials, tools, they can try things out. Not in a production line. That's usually why people don't want to try things, as it's disruptive. But if you give people a sandbox or provide a sandbox they can play in. Simulations, it could be computer simulations, anything to be able to play, touch, feel. And then we do the 7 ways. The 7 flows.
Okay.
So that can vary based on business, but I've done this for healthcare. The flow of the patient, the flow of the person, the service provider, the flow of supplies, the flow of information, flow of engineering. Oh, I got to get in here and do work on whatever, the HVAC or the monitor is in a patient's room, or if it's a lab, So you go over the 7 flows and you actually simulate them. You actually physically walk through it. Sometimes we call that air guitar. It's like you're physically going through the motions, and you'll see all kinds of issues with the design while it's, again, still just a prototype, and you can make changes to it. So the benefits are what some people will call a vertical startup, where you can start up a new process, start up a new product with very, very few changes, problems. So I've had organizations that I've worked with come back later and say, oh, we reduced our change orders or engineering change notices, whatever terminology they use, by like 90% by application of 3P. I've had other organizations that were in the middle of facilitating the exercise early, because we kind of do this kickoff, 5-day kickoff, and then we have these follow-up exercises where they killed the project, that product, then and there in that first week, because we realized it was impossible to hit the target cost. And they openly told me, oh, we would have gone to market with this, not made any money. And so it was great. That was a huge positive thing that they killed that product, because they were never going to make money on it.
Maybe if they had used 3P, they wouldn't have come out with New Coke in 1985. Drew, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so very much. Before I let you go, I have to ask, being in Philadelphia, our guests from Thomas Jefferson University were very, very big Philadelphia Eagles fan. Are you, Drew, a Philadelphia Eagles fan?
Oh, yes.
Well, Congratulations.
I missed our first victory. I was in Brazil working, and I couldn't even watch it
Oh, really?
because I had it set up and the whole NFL, whatever, internet blew up. No one could watch it. I don't know what happened. So, but the second one, this past couple months ago, I was here for that. So that was great.
I am a very, very big football fan. So having a guest from Philadelphia, I've got to allow you to say that you have the team that is the current reigning world champions of professional football. So congratulations to you. I appreciate you being
Thank you.
here on the
Speaking for
show.
all Philadelphians or Philadelphia area, thank you. It's amazing how everyone's happy. I said they'll be happy for a couple of years, you know. They
Drew,
hold the door for you. They do all kinds of nice things.
anything we haven't touched upon that you would like to say before I let you go?
Not really. You know, some people often ask, "What's the future hold?" And to
Mhm.
me, I think it's the same thing. I don't. I think very few companies still today know anything about enterprise excellence or lean, and those that have been maybe too quick to abandon them because they really didn't believe in them. So, in terms of concepts, I think the concepts are still just common sense and can be applied everywhere. It's just a matter. Over 40 years, I've seen, you know, the pendulum swing back and forth in terms of interest in the general topic or specific concepts within that. And I think right now there's not as much interest as there used to be, but it wouldn't surprise me if in the future it comes back, you know, as business circumstances dictate.
Absolutely. Drew Locher, thank you so very
Thank
much.
you for having me, Dan. I appreciate it. Enjoyed it.
This has been fantastic. I've enjoyed it as well. And as you probably noticed, you took me back to a lot of concepts from previous episodes, new
Hmm.
spins, new takes, but how all these concepts are interrelated. I find that fascinating. And I know I sent you some questions beforehand, and we didn't get to all of them. So I'd love to have you back on the show again sometime in the future
Sure.
because I feel like we have so much more to talk about. And if I could make it happen, I would love to get you and Larry Inks on the same episode because I think
Sure.
the conversation, I'd almost just drop out and let you guys talk. That would be amazing.
I don't know. We'll just agree with each other. What fun is that?
True.
But he's right. Leadership and management is very different things.
Thank you so much. This has been
Thank you.
fantastic. And thank you for listening to Quality Time with MoreSteam. You can email the show at qualitytime@moresteam.com. And if you enjoyed the show, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast service. Also, please go ahead and visit our website, moresteam.com, to learn about the software and tools that can help you solve problems, eliminate waste, and do things better. We'll be back in 2 weeks with more Quality Time with MoreSteam. Thanks again.